Eugenics. The word itself sounds scientific, almost elegant, but behind this polished term lies a truly chilling idea. It is the belief that we can improve the human race through selective breeding. Think of it like breeding dogs, breeding horses. You select the ones with the traits you like, speed, size, temperament, then you breed them together, hoping their offspring will inherit those desirable qualities. Eugenics proposed applying this very same logic to people. It was a dangerous and arrogant attempt to play God, to sculpt the future of humanity by deciding who was fit to have children, and more terrifyingly, who was not. The concept splits humanity into two camps. On one side you have the fit, intelligent, strong, healthy, and morally upstanding. Society was encouraged to help them have more children. Then on the other side you have the unfit, physical disabilities, mental illnesses, and low intelligence. But it didn't stop there. The poor, criminals, alcoholics, entire races and ethnic groups deemed inferior by those in power. The goal of eugenics was simple and brutal: multiply the fit and eliminate the unfit. This dark ideology was dressed up in the language of science. Its proponents claimed they were simply applying the new, exciting discoveries of genetics and evolution to better society. They argued it was a forward-thinking, progressive solution to society's biggest problems: poverty, crime, disease. The story of eugenics begins with a man named Sir Francis Galton. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, the famous naturalist who gave us the theory of evolution. Galton was fascinated by his cousin's work, especially the idea of survival of the fittest. He looked around Victorian England and saw a world of stark contrasts. There were the wealthy, educated elites, impoverished masses. Galton believed he knew why. He thought talent, intelligence, moral character were inherited, passed down through families just like hair or eye color. He was convinced that the upper classes were biologically superior. In 1883, Galton coined the term eugenics. It comes from the Greek word eu, meaning good, and genes, meaning born, good in birth. He published books and papers arguing his case. He studied the family trees of famous and successful men, concluding that genius ran in families. Of course, he completely ignored the enormous advantages of wealth connections and education that these men enjoyed. To Galton, it was all in the blood. He proposed that society should encourage its best stock to marry and have many children, while discouraging the worst stock from reproducing. This was the birth of eugenics as a formal idea. The idea did not stay in the dusty halls of academia. It exploded into the public consciousness at the turn of the 20th century. This was an age of immense social change, anxiety, and a deep faith in science and progress. The United States became a global leader in the eugenics movement, a fact often swept under the rug of history. Here, eugenics was not just a theory, it was put into brutal practice. The movement found a disturbingly popular home in mainstream culture. At state fairs, alongside prizes for the best pies and pigs, there were fitter families competitions. Families, predominantly white and middle class, would submit their medical histories and undergo physical and psychological examinations. They would then be judged and awarded medals for their superior genetic fitness. These events were framed as wholesome educational family fun, a way to celebrate good breeding. But behind this folksy facade was a much darker reality. American eugenicists were obsessed with stopping the unfit from having children. Their primary weapon was the law. They successfully lobbied for laws that restricted marriage for people deemed feeble-minded or epileptic. More sinister were the forced sterilization laws. Starting with Indiana in 1907, states across the country passed legislation that allowed the government to surgically sterilize people without their consent. The targets were often patients in mental institutions, but the net was cast wide to include anyone considered a drain on society. The legal justification for this horror was cemented in a 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell. The case involved a young woman named Carrie Buck, who had been committed to a Virginia institution after having a child out of wedlock. The state wanted to sterilize her, claiming she, her mother, and her daughter were all feeble-minded. In his infamous ruling, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." With this chilling sentence, the highest court in the land gave a green light to the eugenics movement. In Britain, the birthplace of eugenics, the movement wore a more polite and intellectual face. It was championed not by carnival barkers but by leading thinkers, writers, social reformers, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, John Maynard Keynes. They saw it as a rational, progressive tool for social planning. The British Eugenics Society, founded by Galton's followers, was a respectable organization. Professors, doctors, politicians. They discussed the degeneration of the British race with calm academic detachment. Unlike the United States, Britain never passed a national law permitting forced sterilization. There was significant opposition from the Catholic Church, the Labour Party, who argued that it was a violation of human rights and an attack on the working class. The British eugenicists, therefore, focused on other methods. They lobbied for the segregation of the feeble-minded into institutions, effectively preventing them from having children by locking them away from society. They were instrumental in the passing of the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, which gave the state sweeping powers to confine people deemed mentally defective. The British movement was deeply entwined with the class system. The eugenicists were overwhelmingly upper-class middle-class, and they directed their concern downwards. They fretted that the lower classes were outbreeding their superiors, and that this would lead to a decline in the nation's overall intelligence and vitality. Their journals were filled with studies, often methodologically flawed, that purported to show higher rates of alcoholism, criminality, mental illness among the poor. The unspoken assumption was that poverty was not a result of social conditions, but a symptom of bad biology. It was a convenient way to blame the victims of an unequal society for their own struggles. Nowhere did the seed of eugenics find more fertile ground and more terrible ground than in Nazi Germany. The Nazis did not invent eugenics, they perfected it. They took the ideas circulating in America, Britain, and pushed them to their most monstrous conclusion. When Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in the 1920s, he praised American eugenics policies. The Nazis looked to U.S. sterilization laws and immigration restrictions as a model. They saw a country already practicing the racial purification they dreamed of. Upon taking power in 1933, the Nazis moved with terrifying speed. One of their first major laws was the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. That law was inspired by American precedents, especially a model drafted by Harry Laughlin. But the German program was far more extensive and brutal. An estimated 400,000 Germans were forcibly sterilized. They were people with physical disabilities, mental illness, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, alcoholism. The Nazi state had declared them life unworthy of life. Sterilization was only the beginning. Eugenic logic demanded a final solution for those who couldn't be cured or improved. In 1939, the Nazis initiated the Action T4 program, a secret euthanasia program to systematically murder disabled children and adults. Doctors, nurses who had sworn to heal were ordered to become killers. Patients were taken from asylums and hospitals to special killing centers, murdered often by lethal injection or in gas chambers disguised as showers. This was the first time the Nazis used poison gas for mass murder, a horrifying dress rehearsal for the Holocaust. Action T4 was the bridge from eugenics to genocide. The same ideology that justified sterilization was used to justify mass murder of Jews, Roma, and others deemed racially inferior. The dark allure of eugenics was not confined to Europe and North America. Its shadow stretched across the globe. Scandinavia, Latin America, Asia adopted its principles. In Sweden, a country often seen as a model of progressive social democracy, a state-sponsored eugenics program was in place from the 1930s to the 1970s. The Swedish government forcibly sterilized over 60,000 people, mostly women. The justifications were familiar: preventing the spread of inferior genes and reducing the social cost of caring for the unfit. The program was carried out quietly, with broad political consensus. A chilling reminder of how easily these ideas can take root even in supposedly enlightened societies. In Latin America, eugenics took on a different flavor. Brazil, Mexico, the focus was less on racial purity in the Nazi sense and more on racial hygiene and nation building. The goal was often whitening the population, promoted European immigration, discouraged reproduction among indigenous populations, discouraged reproduction among Afro-descendant populations. They saw this as a way to improve the national stock and modernize their countries. The reach of eugenics even extended to Asia. In Japan, the national eugenic law was passed in 1940, inspired by the German model. It promoted the sterilization of people with hereditary diseases and people with disabilities. The rhetoric of eugenics was also used to justify Japanese imperialism, framing the Japanese as a pure and superior race destined to lead other Asian peoples. In Singapore, in the latter half of the 20th century, the government launched a controversial policy to encourage university-educated women to have more children. while offering cash incentives to less educated poor women to get sterilized. It echoed the core eugenic principle of promoting reproduction among the fit. Today is September 7, 2025. It might seem like the age of eugenics is long gone, a shameful chapter of history confined to black and white photographs and dusty textbooks. The word itself is toxic. The horrors of the Nazi regime exposed the movement's ultimate destination, and the world recoiled. But ideas are hard to kill. The core beliefs of eugenics, that human worth can be measured by biology, and that society can be improved by controlling who is born, have not disappeared. They have simply changed their clothes. They echo in our world today in subtle and not so subtle ways. We see these echoes in debates about genetic technology. With the power of CRISPR and other gene editing tools, we are on the cusp of being able to alter the human germline to make heritable changes to our DNA. This opens up the possibility of eliminating genetic diseases, a noble goal, but it also opens a Pandora's box. Where do we draw the line between therapy and enhancement? Will we one day be able to select for intelligence, athleticism, or physical appearance? If so, who will have access to these technologies? There is a real danger of creating a new biological class divide, a world of genetic haves and have-nots. This is the specter of a new eugenics, driven not by state coercion, but by the free market and individual choice. We also hear the echoes of eugenics in our social attitudes and policies. When we stigmatize people with disabilities, or imply they are a burden on society, we are channeling eugenic thought. When prejudices against certain racial or ethnic groups are justified with claims about their innate biological differences, that is the ghost of eugenics speaking. It appears in algorithms that have been shown to be biased against certain populations, and in discussions about immigration that frame certain groups of people as less desirable than others. These ideas persist because they offer simple, comforting answers to difficult questions, allowing us to blame biology instead of confronting injustice. This is why remembering the history of eugenics is so critically important. It is not about feeling guilty for the past, it is about being vigilant in the present.